Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Psychedelic Medicine Podcast. I'm Dr. Lynn Marie Morsky, your guide on this journey, and today we're going to be discussing microdosing psilocybin myth versus fact with Dr. Rotem Petranker. Dr. Petranker is the co-founder of the Psychedelic Studies Research Program at the University of Toronto and the Canadian Centre for Psychedelic Science. He recently ran the world's largest randomized control trial on the effectiveness of microdosing psilocybin on major depressive disorder. Now, before we get to Dr. Petranker, just a reminder that the Psychedelic Medicine Podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. Nothing here is to be construed as medical or legal advice. And one more reminder, as always, if you are a clinician of any sort, doctor, nurse, PA, NP, therapist, social worker, and you'd like to learn more about how psychedelic medicine may be beneficial for your patients, please check out the Psychedelic Medicine Association. It is our mission to get you up to speed so that when patients come asking with their psychedelic-related questions, you feel comfortable to have those conversations. You can find more at psychedelicmedicineassociation.org. Now, without further ado, thanks so much for joining us today, Rotem.
What a pleasure to be here. I'm excited to chat.
I'm so excited about this topic. I mean, the one thing, in that little ad I do talking about patients coming to ask things, the number one thing they ask about is microdosing.
Mhm.
And I'd say it's the thing that I've always felt maybe we had the least amount of science for me to give an educated answer. And so I'm very excited to have this episode where we can talk about myths versus facts. And so if we could start by talking about what is the perception out there? What do people think that and by the way, if you are not familiar, psilocybin is the ingredient in magic mushrooms. So if people are talking about microdosing mushrooms, this is what we're talking about. So can we start by what people think microdosing psilocybin will likely do?
Can we take actually one step
Oh,
back? What is
certainly.
microdosing?
Oh, brilliant, brilliant.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because we don't know. There's no real rigorous definition. People say, "Oh, I'm just gonna microdose some mushrooms," and then they often take a random amount. I think what people mean is, "I'm going to take an amount that will not knock me out, won't cause serious hallucinations," but they still use an amount that they often feel. Now, this is in contrast to what people in the literature define it as, which is more like a sub-perceptual dose, a sub-hallucinogenic dose. And I think that that's not what people are actually doing out in the wild, but that's maybe something different. So for now, the way most academics talk about microdosing is we say it's about 10% of a recreational dose. So for people who take about 2 or 2.5 grams of mushrooms when they want to really feel it, when they microdose, they take maybe 200 milligrams.
Okay. And I'm so happy that you backed us up to that. And
Yeah.
also I think, you used a term that a lot of us use in the field, which is sub-perceptual. And then you said sub-hallucinogenic. And I love that you separated those because I really think that that's an important distinction because sub-hallucinogenic, I think we all agree definitely if you're hallucinating, this is not a microdose. But then
Mhm.
people will argue the ones who feel as though they get a benefit from it, that they can perceive that benefit and therefore it's not sub-perceptual anymore. So do you have any thoughts
Yes.
on that?
Oh, definitely. And I thought we would get to this a lot later in this conversation, but um, it's tricky. This is kind of philosophically, really epistemologically, a little bit tricky to put your finger on it because so let's use another example. Let's say someone is taking SSRIs and they're depressed. And so their mood starts improving. Does that mean that they perceive that they're taking SSRIs, or maybe they're actually noticing that they're taking SSRIs because of the side effects, which are commonly, they're really universally reviled. Lack of sex drive, lack of app or increased appetite, kind of loss of interest in living. So I think similarly, when people microdose, sometimes, so this is like in our study, we asked people, we're going to talk, I'm sure, more about what the design was for my trial, but we asked people that were blind, like we were all blinded. It was masked. We don't know if people took a microdose or not. We asked people to say whether they think they're in the placebo or psilocybin condition and how they know it. And some people correctly guessed because of more like the unpleasant aspects, like maybe feeling like their stomach was feeling weird. Um, But a lot of people, I will say that people guessed their condition correctly more than chance. But people also passed sobriety tests pretty much 100% of the time. Um, so I'm actually there's a paper that I'm currently working on, hopefully it'll be published soon, where I argue that the correct definition for a microdose is not sub-perceptual and not sub-hallucinogenic, but rather sub-impairing. Because this is a dose that people correctly perceive or guessed that they were in that condition. It had maybe some effects, and yet they were unimpaired as far as sobriety tests count. So I think that is a more accurate definition for now. But I think where the future is for the definition of microdosing is different people metabolize it differently. And we don't know what is the correct determinant for that. And in the future, I think that will be the way to decide what the correct dose is and for whom.
Yes. Okay. Well, forgive me that I jumped the gun on that, but I do love that we started off with some level setting at this point. Now, okay,
It's very
now that we
important.
have level set what microdosing is and isn't, or may not be, what do people tend to think that it will do as far as in the benefits they may get from it?
So a lot, I conducted a lot of surveys before getting to run a clinical trial, and a lot of what we ask people is kind of what do you microdose for, or what are the main benefits that you've experienced from microdosing? And by a wide margin, people report improved mood is the most common reason and the most common benefit. People also report desire for creativity and also increased creativity from microdosing, improved focus, attention. Um, Increasingly, and it's interesting to have been studying this field for about 10 years, you see that there's trends that are changing. And something that has become a lot more popular in the last couple of years is also microdosing for social engagements, it was not so much a thing before. So yeah, I think people primarily expect improved mood, creativity, focus. Those are kind of the three main things, but there's other reasons too.
Okay, great. Thanks for laying that out. And if we could now go into what you, prior to recording, we were just discussing that there's a microdosing psilocybin book out there that refers to a lot of the previous, like pre-prohibition
Mhm.
psilocybin use. Would you mind discussing a little bit of what was thought about microdosing psilocybin back in that era?
Sure. I think so. This book is, as you said before, we started recording by Torsten Passy, and it, I think he did a lot of really important work around really like sleuthing and finding stuff that is either unpublished or where a microdose was actually the control condition for a large dose study. I think there were a lot of kind of dose finding studies that were the scientific method 50, 60 years ago is not what it is now. So they had very small samples and a lot of other confounds on the quality of the research and our ability to infer from it. But a lot of it was just kind of, let's see if these very small doses do anything at all. But I think overall they kind of found more or less nothing. Um, but I think that it's quite possible that they didn't find anything because the effects are small, because the dose is small. And so in many of these cases, you would need very controlled conditions, large sample sizes, and they didn't have that. And so I mean, I think in the book, Torsten Passy also mentions some of the issues with this research, and it's good work in that sense. But I think that the current wave of research is where we'll be able to get more concrete answers. Because again, I want to be clear that lack of evidence doesn't mean evidence of lack. It just means that they didn't find anything.
I like that. That's always good to remember. Now,
Mhm.
in the interim between the Prohibition era and then let's say, we've gone through, now we have the resurgence of research between when that started again and prior to you starting your study. What kinds of things had research been finding in the microdosing psilocybin realm?
I am one of the people who published the first papers in this current wave because so the way it went is that I in short, I was invited to join a reading group. And when I came to the reading group, I said, we should be doing this. We shouldn't just read about it. And when we were debating which project to tackle first, one of the other members, I actually don't remember who it was, said, hey, like microdosing is exploding on Reddit and there's no published research on it. And so that's what we decided to go with. So I remember, I think between 2015 and 2016 or something, in one of those years, the membership in the microdosing subreddit went from 10,000 to 100,000. It was a huge, huge growth. So there was a lot of excitement. And then we started studying it. There were a couple of other papers that were published, I think, the same year or the year after. But yeah, broadly, people were finding more or less consistent things. Individuals were microdosing to improve mood, and they were mostly reporting improved mood. But also, this is one of the weaknesses of conducting this kind of research where people are already they are believers, and so the placebo effect for them is large. There are other confounds, like these people are already drug enthusiasts, so they're polydrug users. They have also used large doses most of the time. So these are all things that have an impact on mood and well-being as well.
That makes sense. And I'm going to throw in here for anybody who wants to learn more about the placebo effect or some of the early findings of microdosing. We have episodes from Balazs Szegedy on
Right.
the study he did with the placebo effect, and then we have kind of one of the godfathers of microdosing, James Fadiman. We have two episodes with him. One is Q&A of microdosing, and then I forget what the second one is called, but it's also microdosing as well. So you can always check that out. I think the reason that episode has about a bajillion more downloads than anything is because Dr. Fadiman shared it in the subreddit. So that
Mhm.
thank you to the 100,000 people in that subreddit who not all of them tuned in, but
Mhm.
who checked it out. So I recall seeing, so like you said, there's these confounding factors, but I recall seeing in, and this is somewhere in the slides when I give presentations, that there was one of these psychedelic pharmaceutical companies that I think was even doing like a phase 2B study on microdosing for depression. I wish I had pre-looked this up, but do you know the one I'm referring to? Because if not, while
I,
you speak, I'm going to be Googling this. But
there was an LSD study, maybe. Is that what you're referring to?
I'm going to Google while we chat. But uh, so from, let's just say, in this period, we were getting positive results, but there were significant confounding factors because we had a lack of this randomized clinical trial.
Right. Yeah. Basically, yeah. This was all survey work, and to be fair, I mean, yeah, I didn't mention Jim Fadiman's work because partly because he had been doing it since the first wave, and partly because I think the way he was working was a lot more partial to anecdotes and compiling them together. Sure, I mean, I don't even remember how big his data set became. It was like maybe 5 or 6 thousand responses.
I think it was
10,000,
10,000. Yes.
but just all anecdotes of people who swear by it.
Uh, the vast majority, I will say, and if there had been no side effects, I would have believed it would have been harder to take anything. But there was a distinct pattern of the one thing that it didn't seem to be effective for was anxiety.
hmm We found both that it improves and harms anxiety.
Yes. And that was, I
So,
think, in alignment with what they found, because usually it was just kind of like, it works for all the things, right? And what I thought from Dr. Fadiman's that was more interesting than, yes, it works for all the things, was some of the things I had not thought to even investigate using it for, namely something like PMS.
yeah.
Wouldn't have thought about that realm. So I think what I liked that came out of that was just the novel. I'm going to put novel in quotes here because we just kind of think of it in general terms, but kind of more the more like niche ways that people were using it that can then
Mhm.
maybe later serve as ideas for clinical trials kind of thing. But yeah, anxiety, I think they had said like it sometimes works and sometimes worsens.
Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking maybe this is something that Jim spoke about. I don't know. Set and setting are rarely mentioned in the context of microdosing. And a couple of years ago, I wrote a paper with Ido Hartogzon, who's a very interesting thinker. If he hasn't been on the podcast, you should consider
Please
inviting
connect
him.
us.
And we wrote about the importance of set and setting and microdosing because these are psychedelics after all. I'm thinking, so if you microdose and go to work to sit under the flickering lights for 8 hours in your cubicle, versus if you're going to microdose and then go on a walk or do art or do as you wish because it's the weekend, you're going to have very different impacts on your anxiety.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And you are absolutely correct. It was mind biotherapeutics and it was microdosing psilocy or LSD. So
Mhm.
yes, absolutely. That's what it was. So now we are moving on to what did you all at your lab decide to investigate it, and how did you decide to set up the trial?
Um, so we actually when we first ran our surveys, LSD was a lot more popular for microdosing than psilocybin, about a ratio of 2 to 1. And that has changed since, I think, primarily because of kind of cultural trends. But we decided to go with psilocybin rather than LSD, primarily for two reasons. One is that it didn't carry such a strong social stigma, because I don't know if it still does, but at least 10 years ago, people still had a long memory for all the ads that were anti-LSD. So that's one reason. And the other is that LSD has a much longer half-life time, and we didn't want to have to keep people in the lab for such a long time. So we landed on psilocybin. We were debating which dose, and we had, let's say, an insider report that 3 milligrams of psilocybin were definitely noticeable. And we wanted to be kind of honest and true to what we thought would be a microdose. So we decided to go with 2 milligrams. And then we decided to do it weekly rather than bi-weekly, which is the Fadiman protocol, which is the most common one, for two main reasons. I mean, to be honest, the main motivator was we had to keep people in the lab for the whole dosing day. If we're doing it for 8 weeks, that means that for 8 weeks, people have to take a day off every week. And that would have excluded a lot of people. It would have been really unfair. And we wanted it to be a real community sample, which I'm happy to say we ended up getting. So that worked. But we were also able to find justification for that. In our surveys, we found that the most common protocol was yes, every 3 days. But the second most common protocol was once a week. And so if people were doing it once a week, then presumably they were finding benefit in it. So we felt comfortable using that frequency.
And then how did you decide to study it distinctly in relation to major depressive disorder?
I did not want to do that at all. I was just curious to see if if microdosing works. And then I just wanted to test it on healthy individuals. And Health Canada, which is our equivalent of the FDA, said, whoa, whoa, these are very dangerous substances. And this dose, very dangerous. This does not justify the risk-benefit analysis. So you have to recruit people who are unwell. So the next thing we did was to change it to persistent depressive disorder, which in the DSM-4 was dysthymia. Um, but we just couldn't find enough people because it's a fairly rare disorder. People were either too depressed or not depressed enough. And so we again changed the protocol to include major depressive disorder just because this is what people were reporting. They were taking microdoses to improve their mood. So this seemed like a likely target.
Okay. All right. That all makes sense. That's so interesting, the lack of dysthymic people. But it makes sense. So, okay, now you've got the dose, you've got how often you're going to dose them, and we have the condition. What was decided to be the in-room set and setting for this?
Great question. Because I was like, wait, set and setting are really important. So this is actually so primary target for this trial is to say whether microdosing 2 milligrams of psilocybin for either 4 or 8 weeks is effective for major depressive disorder. This is the primary question. We have a bunch of other exploratory measures that were based on other things that people were reporting. So we asked if it makes you more mindful, if it has any changes on your personality, if it affects your focus and attention. many other variables that we had reports on. And the other thing that we wanted to ask was, does it matter if people are microdosing in a clinical environment or in a more kind of supportive, pleasant environment? So we actually ran it in two different clinics. One is still a quite nice pediatric clinic that had, just a bunch of exam rooms with beds and kind of like the whole clinical environment. And the other one was at the offices of Field Trip, which it was built for psychedelic therapy. Very lush greenery, comfy chairs, soft lights, the works. And so we really wanted to compare these two conditions and see if there's any difference.
Oh, very cool. And then you said they had to stay there for 8 hours. Were they alone? Was there a facilitator? Who was present in the room?
So people were essentially alone in a room, or they could go out for walks, but we did not encourage them to make friends with other participants. And I trained the staff to be, this was tricky. We trained them to try and find a balance between being friendly and yet professional. Because one of the things that we were concerned about is, especially when people are more impressionable, they feel like we're being too nice to them, then everyone's just going to feel amazing. So we tried to keep a balance. Yeah, just to keep it kind of controlled. So we really tried to have the set and setting as controlled as possible.
That's so interesting. I'm trying to put myself in the room for 8 hours, and I'm wondering, you know, are these people that may never get 8 hours to themselves? Period. Is that like a confounding factor that just like we wonder with the MDMA and all the other trials is like maybe you just never had good psychotherapy before or in this quantity. So there's
Mhm.
always kind of those extra factors that you wonder how they play in, as opposed to like you said, this person who's taking it weekly and then going to sit at their cubicle
Yeah.
and not really getting their set and setting. So very interesting. So, okay. So you've got the 4 group, the 4 week group, the 8 week group, the field trip fancy setting, the more clinical setting. What kinds of things? Oh, what was the size of the population you studied?
So we had, I think, 39 participants completed the whole study, and a handful of others that completed only the first few weeks. And just to clarify the way the design was, so people come in, they're randomized into either psilocybin first or placebo first. And for the first 4 weeks, everyone's blinded to their condition. So we don't know, they don't know. And then after 4 weeks, we cross them over to open label. And that means that for the last 4 weeks, everyone is taking psilocybin and they know that they're taking psilocybin. And that way we can compare if you were taking psilocybin before and you weren't improving, and now that you know that you're taking psilocybin, you're improving, that tells us something.
Definitely. I love that. I love that. Something just popped into my head. Oh, um, were there any exclusions for medications, or were these patients, if they were on an antidepressant, allowed to stay on it?
No antidepressants.
Okay.
There were many other exclusions that are kind of standard. I think that the ones that may not be so standard is, yeah, they can't be on medication. They can't make lifestyle changes that are related. So they can't start or end therapy because this study also did not include any psychotherapy component. They were asked not to change their diet, not to change their caffeine or nicotine intake, or cannabis. They were not allowed to use psychedelics. I think so. We were hoping to recruit exclusively a psychedelics naive sample, but I don't think we were able to. So we settled for most people were psychedelics naive, but the exclusion criterion was at least 6 months of no psychedelics.
Okay, that makes sense. All right.
Mhm.
So, drum roll. What did you find?
So first of all, we found that there was no difference between the two settings. Um, so that's already somewhat interesting. Um, we found that everyone, regardless of their condition, got a lot better. Like a lot better. Like the effect size of, I don't remember, like over two, something huge. And I think that that may have kind of any effect that the actual microdosing may have had was lost in the wash. because it was just the effect of participating in the trial was so overwhelmingly large.
Oh, you're saying even for the placebo.
Yeah, everyone got so much better.
Interesting.
Yeah. So we mostly did not have any significant differences between the placebo and psilocybin groups. There were a couple of exceptions, and we're not done analyzing all the data yet. But I want to be honest in my reporting. So I'm just going to say it how it is, and your listeners and viewers can decide how to interpret these findings. So we had, I think, four or five, no, four measures of depression. So there is one that's kind of clinician based that, I was doing a lot of this as the clinician. There's a structured interview that you conduct with participants and you measure how many symptoms of depression they have. And there was no difference in that. There were three other self-report measures of depression. There is only a significant difference on one of them, where people who were microdosing were doing better. And that was on the dysfunctional attitude scale, which measures more cognitive kind of assumptions about life. Oh, sorry. So
Interesting.
let me give you an example. Oh, I thought you wanted to
Yes.
say something. Let me give an
No.
example. So one of the items in the dysfunctional attitude scale is if I fail partly, it's as bad as failing completely. So if you agree with that, you are more likely to be depressed. And people were doing better on that.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Did you have, okay. So we'll keep going on, then I'll save my questions.
Sure. And then we had a lot of other measures. Like I said, I'm not done analyzing all of them, but so far, the only other significant effect we found was in a measure called the inclusion of self in others. And in this task, you ask participants whether how close they feel to other people, and you ask them to pick. There's pictures or diagrams of circles where it's like the circle are distinct, a little bit of overlap, more and more and more overlap until they're completely overlapping. And people in the microdosing group were increasingly feeling more and more connected with other people, which I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. I have written about that. I have a theory about how I think this is a primary mechanism for how psychedelics operate. So it makes sense that people were feeling more connected. So I think these are the primary findings. Well, except for how pretty much everyone passed sobriety tests.
And when you say not everyone, how many people would you say didn't?
So there were something like 543 sobriety tests administered because people were administered a sobriety test either once or twice every time they came to the lab. And three were failed. And one of those three was in the placebo group.
Very
So,
interesting.
yeah, so people overwhelmingly passed.
And what are the thoughts on the confounding factors from the like placebo group? Is it low blood sugar? Were they taking something else that they weren't reporting, perhaps alcohol or something like that?
No, I think the power of suggestion is huge.
Very, very interesting. Okay. So to sum up, everybody got better. But so the people dosing got better. The people on placebo got better. The people dosing specifically, the one thing they did get better that the placebo didn't on was this cognitive, I forget exactly what you called it.
Two things. They
Yes.
got better at the dysfunctional attitude scale
Yes.
and better at the inclusion of other in self scale.
Okay, okay, the attitudes and the inclusion. Okay, I was going to ask for the dysfunctional attitudes that you said was like a cognitive processing thing. Do you do you think that has anything to do with, I mean, maybe this is just a wild guess, but like with neuroplasticity benefits, whereas they, like they were able to process that better? Or do you think it's just solely like if you're less depressed, you won't think so negatively on that kind of all or nothing thinking?
Yeah, so I am fully with you. I think what you're saying is what I was thinking is that people were a little bit more flexible. Like, so the other measures are more like, how do you feel? Are you still really sad? Are you still feeling really depressed? And people were saying, yeah, I'm still feeling really depressed. But when it's not so much about how you feel, but rather how do you view the world? What do you think is true? Then they were showing a little bit more malleability. And I think to me, this is actually a very interesting signal, and I'm excited to study it more. I'm hoping to do that soon. I think that, the way we've been approaching psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is very humanistic, person-centered, which is normally how I do therapy. This is what I like as a therapist, and I think it works so well with most humans. But I'm thinking about critical periods and how this neuroplasticity that we induce, and wouldn't just normal CBT work so well? Because really the dysfunctional attitude scale is very CBT-esque. Um, so I think for me, this is the next step. Microdosing plus either run-of-the-mill CBT or some kind of psychedelic informed CBT. I think that would be very interesting.
Yeah, because we know it was effective in the tobacco trials, right?
Right.
Yes.
Definitely.
I think that's the exciting next frontier. We know this works. How can we make it work even better? Which adjunct do we
Mhm.
add? Even the Psychedelic Medicine Association, our webinar last night was ketamine adjuncts. Like, we know it works. How can we improve on that?
Sorry, I want to say we don't know that microdosing works.
Oh, yes.
The,
Good. Good
like
to add. You're right. I meant
I,
like the psilocybin for tobacco. Like the higher doses tend to work. So what can we do to build on that? But yes,
they might.
please put the fine point on the fact that we don't know that.
So we found one significant effect out of four measures. So 75% of the time is this is another way of saying it. 75% of the time we found nothing. So it might be that what we found was a fluke. So this needs to be interpreted cautiously. We need to collect more data. I want other people to replicate this. Maybe there was some systemic error in the way I was doing it, and other people will not make the same error. The other thing I want to mention, I don't know how long ago you hosted Balash, but he's
Years.
okay. So I'm sure you noticed he's very, very smart and very thoughtful. And I attended his talk in Psychedelic Science a couple of months ago, and he showed very clearly that the way we're measuring the effectiveness of psychedelics is we're really putting our thumb on the scale. I'm not going to get into the technical aspect of it now, and I strongly encourage anyone who's interested in this to look up. I think he's already published it, so look up Bala Shigeti's work. And I wonder, I have not looked since I heard this talk, I've not looked at the smoking cessation studies, but might it be that we're kind of exaggerating the effect of psychedelics? And I want to be clear that even if psychedelics are, and this is what I think Balish is suggesting, they are roughly as effective as SSRIs. If that is the case, that is amazing because SSRIs suck. They're bad in so many ways. And if we find that something that's roughly equally effective and doesn't have all these negative side effects, we hit the jackpot.
Yes, and I'm going to put in my disclaimer here. SSRIs save lots of people all the time, so we are not pill shaming you if you are on them. If they are working for you, please continue. But we know that they very often have side effects or don't work for a lot of people. So, yeah,
Definitely.
amazing if we could get something that with fewer side effects that you have to take fewer times,
Mm,
and that works in a mechanism that may lead to even further brain improvements instead of just kind of like you said tamping down emotions and feelings, how instead maybe like you said increases connectedness.
mm.
By the way, you had hinted at your theory about how psychedelics work related to the increase in connectedness, so if you wouldn't mind sharing.
Sure. I just want to say thank you for saying that about SSRIs. I absolutely am not looking to shame anyone, and I'm sorry if it came across that way. I'm more like I have been on SSRIs before, and I think a lot of people have. And I mean, yeah, we know what it's like, and if we can find better things, and at the very least, if we can diversify our toolkit, that would be excellent.
Yes, agreed, agreed.
Um, so I actually published a paper about this a couple of years ago, where the different people have different theories about how psychedelics work. Some of them are more biological, and I am not so much a neuroscientist. I am more cognitive and clinical. And so mine is kind of more metaphorical, but maybe speaks more directly to experience. We know that some of the brain networks that are implicated in psychedelics and the way they operate have to do with salience. So our salience landscape shifts, it changes what is important to us. And the other is connectedness, the feeling of, yeah, of like, so It's interesting because this arose in qualitative analysis that we ran like 8 years ago, maybe, where we found that people who microdosed, regardless of why they microdosed, they more or less all said that they got to what they wanted through an increased sense of meaning. And then we said, hold up, what is meaning? We don't like meaning isn't a thing in and of itself. Meaning is an emergent kind of experience that we have from other things. So what might that be? And then I kept thinking about it, and so I think it has to do with an increase or a shift in salience, thing that didn't matter, now matter. And the other is, and I think this is core, we are in what others have called the meaning crisis, and I am fully behind that. And I think so much of the pandemic of depression and anxiety is because we are feeling so alone, and this alienation is what then gives rise to a sense of meaninglessness. And so I think conversely, the way psychedelics work is that they make us feel connected, and this is what people have been reporting, at least qualitatively, that I've observed, connected to friends, family, sometimes, humanity, the ground they live on, the place that they are at, their traditions. And this sense of groundedness and connectedness is then what gives rise to, oh, I am. So if I'm, for example, if I'm connected to my tradition, I'm just the final link in this very long chain. I'm not untethered. I'm not a feather in the wind. I'm part of something. And then I could add another link after me. And then we're all in this together. And that's, I think, what makes people really improve, or sorry, experience the improvements that we are observing. Because so much of what we do in the scientific study of psychedelics is we're just looking at the fruit. We're like, does this produce what we want? And I'm like, whoa, let's look at the whole tree. Let's look at the roots. What is the process? What is the mechanism? And I think that that is what then ultimately, this increased sense of connectedness is what ultimately bears the fruit of improved mood.
I love that. And I agree. And I'm excited to hear what you think with this new information that you have. Like you said, would your next step be to try to combine something like CBT, or where do you think you'll go from here?
That's a great question because so if it were up to me, yeah, the next study would be pretty much the same protocol with CBT. So maybe 8 weeks of CBT paired with either 4 or 8 weeks of microdosing and maybe 3 times the sample. However, funding agencies are pretty risk averse. And I've been trying to get the Canadian government to fund just an extension of the same design, an identical design for about 2 years. And they're like, this sounds risky. I'm like, guys, I have done literally this. And then, are you sure? So I think it's going to be a while, especially in the current funding climate, to do anything that's really groundbreaking. But I think the next thing will just be an extension of what we already did because it might be, like I said in the beginning of this conversation, the dose is small, the effect, if any, is small. We need large samples. So maybe some things that we didn't catch with 39 participants we'll catch with 150.
That makes sense. And now, if somebody's listening to this thinking, well, basically everybody got better, whether they knew they were taking the psilocybin, whether they were not taking it, meaning I should just take this and I would improve. So that brings up, did you have any adverse events, any side effects?
Uh, I think just to say, if someone is listening to this and hearing that everyone got better regardless of whether they took a microdose, the message is you can get better without a microdose.
Also true.
But yeah, but if folks are interested, there were like some very mild and transient adverse events, which means really light stuff and it went away very quickly, like headaches, nausea. Some people were feeling sleepy, which I had never heard of before with microdosing, but yeah, that was pretty interesting. Um, Dizziness. Some people were reporting improved sleep. Some people were reporting difficulty sleeping. There was definitely one person who was reporting improved PMS. Or so yeah, she used to have very, very bad symptoms, and her symptoms improved a lot during the trial. So that also resonates with what Jim Fadiman found.
Interesting.
Um, yeah, so there were for sure, I think. So it's interesting to look at the adverse events, and we definitely collected those. I think it's also interesting. We collected a lot of qualitative data, and people reported a lot of other very interesting experiences that are not exactly negative or positive, just kind of not the kind of thing that you normally find in a pharma trial.
Do tell.
Yeah, well, I think that for me, the most interesting, well, there were, yeah, there's so many. Uh, so we didn't have OCD as an exclusion. And so there were a couple of people that had a diagnosis of OCD. And one of them that I was the clinician who worked with him the whole trial. So I have more of an impression. He was saying that he was getting more intrusive thoughts, but they were less intense. But overall, his anxiety went up during the trial. And in retrospect, I think that someone like him could probably benefit from more supportive therapy while under the influence. Because I'm thinking about a person with OCD who's kind of like very anxious and needs things to be a certain way. And then things start getting a little loosey-goosey, and that could cause even more distress rather than feeling lighter and easier. Another interesting thing is, again, this is 2 milligrams. It's a tiny dose. Some people had pretty significant psychedelic experiences. Yeah, like crying, like these kind of cathartic experiences, seeing stuff. And I think was very interesting because then it again speaks to how different people be different and we process it differently. And I'm increasingly of the mind that it's not so much about any physical or, it's not about genetics per se. I think it is likely more about some personality variables. And I think that would be the next frontier. Some people have started on that, like there's an Imperial College measure for that, but it doesn't account for a ton of variability. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done on that.
And did you say you would also ask them about creativity, how creative they felt?
Oh, not so much about how creative they felt. We
Oh,
actually gave them creativity tasks.
oh, cool.
They didn't do better.
They didn't do better. Oh my gosh, this is so interesting. So
Yeah.
interesting. So overall, you could even take no psilocybin and just hanging out with really friendly Canadians is good for your mood, which I think everybody in America would have assumed. But your patients were already Canadian, so it wasn't like that was a wild change from their day to day.
Yeah.
But I think maybe what you said, going back to the connectedness, maybe this person lives a very isolated life and then all of a sudden once a week they have somebody caring about them, like they are the center of that person's focus for the day, and they may never be the center of somebody's focus, right?
Yeah, definitely. We had one of our participants was someone who was very, very depressed, like had not left their apartment in months, and then came to our clinic once a week for 8 weeks. And yeah, you know what? They felt a lot better. So it makes sense because they're feeling like they're doing something for society. They're like at the forefront, and yeah, and I think that's really what's so important. And yeah, and if I could change course, it's quite possible that I would have switched to just trying to study the placebo response because that was just so powerful.
Yeah, that is wild. Well, this has been fascinating. I love every time we can get little by little more information on the facts side of the facts versus myth on microdosing psilocybin. So thank you for that. Can you tell the listeners where to find out more about you and your work?
My pleasure. Yeah. So you can, if you Google Rotem Psychedelics, you'll find me because there's only one of me. And you can look at the website for the Canadian Center for Psychedelic Science. So you can see some of our publications there. There are many papers coming out of this upcoming or this trial that we just finished are coming up. So yeah, keep your eyes open. I do want to say one more thing, if that's
Please.
okay.
Oh, of course.
We didn't talk at all about the quality of research in psychedelics, which is something that's near and dear to my heart.
Oh,
And
yes.
so,
Let's discuss.
so I don't want to belabor it too much because I know that the podcast can only be so long. But I do want to say open science is really, really important. And not a lot of people do that in psychedelics. It has become a pretty standard thing in other disciplines, but I think in psychedelics, people are still like, it's not such a big deal. I think it's really, really important that we pre-register our hypotheses and that we share our data. because we need to be accountable and we need to work together. And so if folks if you read something and you're like, I don't like this evidence is, I almost don't believe this, check if they pre-registered their hypotheses, check if they practice open science. If people are practicing open science, that should be your telltale that you can trust what they publish. And if not, you should be more skeptical.
And where could somebody check this? Would this be a thing where they're checking, at least in the US, clinicaltrials.gov?
No,
No.
this is clinicaltrials.gov is not, I mean, it's related to, but it's not quite that. So
Okay.
there are multiple platforms to use for pre-registration. I use the open science framework, but people will be explicit about how they either practice open science or pre-register their hypotheses. Look for those words.
Okay, that will be, will they mention that in the article?
Yes.
Okay, okay.
So yeah, if you read my articles, you'll see whenever. The other thing is, if you read my articles, you'll see some places I say, these are my pre-registered hypotheses. And I followed them. And then I was like, oh, I'm also interested in other things. And I'm going to be explicit that these things are exploratory. I didn't plan on doing it. And I think that level of transparency is what's required. And that should make you trust the science you read. Oh, I also, one more thing, sorry,
Sure, no worries.
about the placebo response.
Yes.
My colleague Jay Olson, also is at the University of Toronto, does very, very interesting work on placebo. He's done a little bit of work on psychedelics. If people are interested in the placebo response, I highly recommend checking out his work.
Excellent. And our dear content manager, Jared, will put links to all those things that he can find in the show notes if anybody's interested. Well, Rotem, again, very grateful. Would love to have you back on anytime you have follow-up trials or information or things to discuss. But it has been a true pleasure having you on today.
Oh, pleasure's all mine. This was a real treat. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. All right. For everybody else out there, until next time.